Kia ora team, welcome back to the 2.3 gas exchange video series. This is video 4. In this video you'll be learning about the advantageous adaptations of the lung system and the limitations of the lung system. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how specific adaptations of the lung system enable humans to survive in their terrestrial niche, and discuss the advantages and limitations of the lung system. So in video 2, we talked about the 4 characteristics of an efficient gas exchange system. And so the lung system needs to have adaptations for maximizing the surface area to volume ratio of alveoli, and coming under this are adaptations to prevent lung infections. The lung system must also have adaptations to keep the alveoli moist, and they must also have adaptations to minimize the diffusion distance across the alveoli. They must be thin. And finally, the lung system needs to have adaptations to maximize the concentration gradient across the alveoli, and this includes adaptations for ventilation. As you can see, these 4 types of adaptations are all to do with alveoli because alveoli are the specialized respiratory surface of the lung system of humans. A large surface area to volume ratio is a requirement for efficient gas exchange because the more sites for gases to enter and exit the specialized respiratory surface, the faster the rate of diffusion. The lung system has adapted to maximize the surface area to volume ratio through the extensive branching of bronchi and bronchioles, which lead to about 600 million alveoli. If there was no branching of bronchi or bronchioles, then there wouldn't be as much alveoli. And if there were less alveoli, there wouldn't be enough specialized respiratory surface. There wouldn't be enough sites for gases to enter and exit the blood through diffusion. This picture here shows the extensive branching of the airways, the bronchioles. And this picture here is obviously a sponge, but this is here to represent the many folds, the extensive folding of alveoli that make up the lungs. So this is an actual picture of your lungs, and these sacs here, air-filled sacs, are your alveoli. Can you see how there's extensive folding of the specialized respiratory surface? Because of this extensive folding, hundreds of millions of alveoli are formed, which maximizes the surface area to volume ratio. What about adaptations for preventing infections? One thing that can reduce the surface area to volume ratio is infection or damage to the lungs, the alveolar surface. So it's a problem that air is dirty and full of bacteria, viruses, and fungal spores, among other unwanted particles in polluted air. Infectious organisms like bacteria and viruses, like coronavirus, love the lung system because it's warm and moist. It's a perfect environment for them to grow and reproduce. If lung infection happens, they can destroy alveoli. And if unwanted particles got into our lungs, they could completely block airways and block air from getting into the alveoli, and this significantly reduces the surface area to volume ratio of the specialized respiratory surface, the alveoli. This will reduce the rate of diffusion and the rate of gas exchange. So the lung system has adaptations to prevent infections and to prevent unwanted particles getting into the lungs. One of those adaptations are the hairs inside our nose, and these small hairs trap dirt. Let's just watch this video.
The nostrils and the nasal cavity. The 2 openings of the nose are called nostrils. They bring air into the hollow spaces of the nose, called the nasal cavities. The nasal cavities are lined by the small hair and mucous membrane. The mucous membrane secretes a thin, sticky fluid called mucus. The mucus and the hair trap dirt, dust particles, viruses and bacteria, and prevent them from reaching the other organs of the respiratory system. The mucous membrane also warms and moistens the incoming air.
Great, so those were the nose hairs that trap dirt. Another adaptation is called the mucociliary escalator. Muco refers to the mucus that the lady was talking about in that video that lines the nasal cavity, the trachea, and the bronchi. Mucociliary, the ciliary part, refers to the ciliated cells lining the trachea and the bronchi. And these ciliated cells are cells with literally finger-like projections that can literally move. They can sway like this. These finger-like projections are called cilia, and they beat or sway to transport a sheet of mucus that's collected infectious organisms or other unwanted particles from the air. And this beating moves all this mucus and gross stuff back towards the mouth, and then you just swallow it without thinking about it. So in this GIF here, you've got all of these cells that line your trachea or your bronchi, and these cells have finger-like projections that can sway back and forth. When it sways back and forth, it transports mucus and all of the dirty things that stick to the mucus back up to the throat to be swallowed. So the mucociliary escalator, this thing here, prevents infection, and therefore it plays a huge role in ensuring that dirt and dust and debris don't get into our lungs, and it ensures we have a large surface area to volume ratio of alveoli. I want you guys to fully appreciate the mucociliary escalator because it's just such a cool adaptation and how it prevents the alveoli from infection. So let's just watch this video here. So air enters the nasal cavity and through the trachea. And in this trachea, you've got these cartilage rings, and you've also got this thick sheet of mucus, which is very sticky that viruses and dirty particles can stick to. Underneath this mucus are ciliated cells, so cells with cilia. And the cilia can literally move or sway, and this swaying moves a sheet of mucus back up to the throat for it to be swallowed. And this is a close-up picture of actual cilia in real life. Okay, now let's look at adaptations for moisture. So gases must first dissolve in water before they can diffuse across the specialized respiratory surface. Therefore, the specialized respiratory surface needs to be kept moist. So it's a problem that air is dry, because not only does it stop gases from diffusing, it can also risk drying out the lungs and therefore damaging the delicate alveoli. So the lung system has adaptations to keep itself moist and to prevent itself from drying out. The first adaptation is really obvious. The lung system is located internally inside the chest cavity to protect them from physical damage, obviously, but also to protect them from drying out. The second adaptation is that the mucus lining the trachea and the bronchi humidify or moisten the air as it enters the lung system. Mucus, remember that stuff that coats your trachea and your nasal cavity, is high in water. So getting humidified or getting moistened means that the air mixes with water vapor from the mucus. So even though the air we breathe in is really dry, by the time this inhaled air reaches the alveoli deep in our lungs, the air should be adequately humidified and not be as dry. The third adaptation is that the alveolar cells secrete this substance called surfactant. This is a fluid that keeps the alveolar surface moist, and it allows gases to dissolve into it before diffusion happens. Now let's look at adaptations for a thin respiratory surface. A thin respiratory surface is required for efficient gas exchange because thin means a short diffusion distance for gases. This thin or short diffusion distance is achieved in the lung system because the respiratory surface is only 2 cells thick. It's very thin, and the diffusion distance is short. So in this diagram, you can see that there are only 2 layers that make up the specialized respiratory surface that separate air from blood. These 2 layers are the alveolar cell and the capillary cell. So the alveolar cell are the cells that make up the alveolus, and the capillary cells are the cells that make up the capillaries. So for carbon dioxide to diffuse from the blood to the air, it only has to cross 1 capillary cell and 1 alveolar cell to get from blood to air. Similarly, for oxygen to diffuse from air to blood, it only has to cross 1 alveolar cell and 1 capillary cell. This is a very short diffusion distance, and this helps maximize the rate of diffusion and therefore the rate of gas exchange. Now let's look at adaptations for maximizing the concentration gradient across the specialized respiratory surface. The concentration gradient across this alveoli is what drives diffusion and gas exchange. So a large concentration gradient is required for efficient gas exchange. And this is exactly what happens at the alveolus. Blood arriving at the alveolus is oxygen poor. It has a low oxygen concentration, and that's represented by blue red blood cells. Blue means low oxygen. New air arriving at the alveolus is oxygen rich, loads of oxygen, has a high oxygen concentration. So because the oxygen concentrations are different, low and high, oxygen will diffuse from an area of high concentration in the air to an area of low concentration in the blood. So blood leaving the alveoli is now oxygen rich, and the air leaving the alveoli is now oxygen poor, and we exhale that oxygen poor air. The diffusion of carbon dioxide works in a similar manner. Blood arriving at the alveolus is carbon dioxide rich. It has a high carbon dioxide concentration. New air arriving at the alveolus is carbon dioxide poor. It has a low carbon dioxide concentration. Because the carbon dioxide concentrations are different, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from an area of high concentration in the blood to an area of low concentration in the air. The air leaving the alveoli is now carbon dioxide rich, and we get that out through exhalation. So for diffusion to happen, we need to maintain this large concentration gradient. If ventilation or blood circulation stopped, so let's say we had a heart attack, the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration gradient across this alveoli would be significantly reduced, and this will reduce gas exchange, meaning the alveoli can't take oxygen from the air and it can't get rid of carbon dioxide from the blood. Here's another diagram showing the blood vessels called capillaries here. They surround the alveoli. So ventilation of the lungs here, air going in, air going out, and blood flow through the capillaries means that any oxygen that comes into the blood is always being removed. This maintains a high concentration gradient across the alveolus. Let's watch this video here about gas exchange at the alveolus.
Each alveolus is surrounded by a dense network of blood capillaries. As the air enters the alveoli, the concentration of oxygen inside each alveolus is higher than that in the blood capillaries, and the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher in the blood capillaries than in the alveoli. This causes the oxygen to diffuse from the alveolus into the blood capillaries. In the same way, the carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood capillaries into the alveolus.
Now, have you ever asked yourself why humans need a circulatory system? Why we need a heart? Why we need blood and blood vessels? It's all in the size humans can grow to. Humans are actually really, really large animals compared to, let's say, worms or snails. And remember from previous lessons that as organisms get larger, the diffusion distance gets farther. If the human gas exchange system just relied on simple passive diffusion to move oxygen from our lungs right down to our feet, diffusion would take so long that there's no way for aerobic respiration to take place or to carry on, and your toes would literally die and fall off. Diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide is only efficient when the diffusion distance is small. So this is where the mighty circulatory system comes in. The circulatory system is made up of the heart, which is a really strong muscle, blood, which carries oxygen, and blood vessels, which are tubes that transport blood. Blood in the lungs participate in gas exchange by releasing carbon dioxide waste and absorbing oxygen. Then the heart actively pumps blood around the body to get the oxygen to cells that need it for aerobic cellular respiration, and it does this relatively quickly. The heart uses energy to pump this blood, but the energy spent is all worth it because this way of transporting oxygen and blood from the lungs to the cells in the rest of the body is much faster than diffusion. If oxygen wasn't pumped by the heart around the body, the diffusion distance for oxygen from the lungs to your toes would be way too far and it would take way too long. So with a circulatory system, that diffusion distance is greatly reduced because passive diffusion would only have to be across the very thin cell membranes of the alveoli. So all of those adaptations that we talked about are advantages of the lung system. Now let's talk about the limitations of the lung system, and there are 3 limitations you need to know about. 1, its incompatibility with water. 2, this thing called tidal ventilation and residual volume. And 3, this thing called dead space. So one of the most obvious limitations of the lung system is that it can't be used to breathe underwater. So this means the lungs can't ventilate water. And why? Well, remember that water is dense, and in fact, it's too dense to be ventilated by the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. And if there's no ventilation, gas exchange would stop because there's no concentration gradient to drive diffusion of carbon dioxide and oxygen. The other reason for this incompatibility with water is that the lungs can't actually exchange gases efficiently enough to sustain life. Because remember that oxygen in water is extremely low. And even though we have 300 million alveoli, this surface area to volume ratio in the lungs is not large enough to make up for this really low 1% of oxygen in water. The surface area to volume ratio in the lungs can actually only carry out gas exchange efficiently with air because air has a much higher percentage of oxygen. Another limitation of the lung system is tidal ventilation. The term tidal ventilation describes how air enters and exits the lungs through the same way. So air enters from the mouth, goes to the trachea, goes to the smaller airways. But then it exits the same way, smaller airways, trachea, and mouth. Tidal ventilation is a limitation of the lung system because air breathed in, which is rich in oxygen, mixes with the air breathed out, which is poor in oxygen. And air breathed in, which is poor in carbon dioxide, mixes with the air breathed out, which is rich in carbon dioxide. This mixing of air during tidal ventilation lowers the oxygen concentration and increases the carbon dioxide concentration of the air that actually gets into the alveoli. This reduces the concentration gradient across the specialized respiratory surface, the alveoli, and this makes gas exchange less efficient. Residual volume is linked to tidal ventilation, and this residual volume is also a limitation of the lung system. I'm not sure if you've noticed this because you probably don't spend too much time thinking about each breath you take unless you're a meditator, but have you noticed that when you're doing quiet breathing, so when you're breathing while at rest or under normal circumstances, you're only letting a small volume of air in and just letting a small volume of air out. As long as you're alive, you can never fully exhale all the air out of your alveoli. You can never exhale all the air out of your lungs. There will always be some air left behind in your alveoli. And this volume of air is called the residual volume. Residual meaning stuff that's left behind. In this case, that stuff is air. So this residual volume that you can't force out, so this is the forced volume here, all of this, but this residual volume is the volume you can't force out. It's a major limitation because it's actually stale air, meaning it's oxygen poor and carbon dioxide rich. Because you can't ventilate this out, it's always just left behind. And because it's stale, we don't want this air mixing with the fresh air that we breathe in when we ventilate. Why? Because it lowers the oxygen concentration of the air that actually reaches your alveoli. So residual volume plus tidal ventilation reduces the concentration gradient of oxygen and carbon dioxide across your alveoli. And the third limitation, this last limitation, is called dead space. Dead space refers to the 30% of air that enters the body but remains in the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. So this is the air that never makes it to the alveoli to participate in gas exchange. Dead space also refers to the air that makes it to the alveoli but doesn't participate in gas exchange. Because think about it, only the air that's right up against the alveoli can participate in gas exchange. If it's air like in the middle of the alveoli but it's not up against the membrane, it's not going to participate in gas exchange. And that's also dead space. So dead space is a limitation because not all of the air inhaled gets to participate in gas exchange. So well done, you've made it to the end of the lesson. So by now you should be able to explain how adaptations of the lung system enable humans to survive in their terrestrial niche, and discuss the advantages and the limitations of the human lung system. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.